Hello everybody, this is Blake J. Watson, and welcome to part 2 of Odin and the Psychedelic Experience. Our first truly fundamental clues which connect Odin to the psychedelic experience comes from his name. Odin, of course, is the Old Norse variant of the Germanic or Proto-Germanic Vodin or Wotan. Going further back, we see that this has Indo-European roots. For instance, the Indo-European word ve or vo, which have the same exact meaning. These two words denote something extraordinary, i.e. extraordinary, or supernatural, something beyond the mundane, something that has a transcendent value. This is why we still say whoa to this day when something shocking or out of the ordinary takes place. Wotan obviously derived its suffix from this Indo-European vo or ve, and this denotes something out of the normal, something beyond the usual, something transcendent or profound. But in the ancient world, before Christianity, there were no clear-cut lines between the secular and the sacred. In other words, secularism did not exist. Everything had an air to it of wonder, mystique, nostalgia. In other words, everything had a sacredness to it. So the fact that Odin denoted something that was out of the ordinary, something that was beyond normal, when gods and goddesses were a very normal aspect of the daily life, raises a serious question. And it can only be answered if we look at the perspective of perception and changing of perceptions. In other words, mind alterations. When something appears as out of the ordinary for people who lived in a supernaturally charged environment, we have to conclude that it must be a psychical change or an extra psychical experience, given the fact that the psyche is what is perceiving everything. All the spirits charged within nature, all the sprites, all the nymphs, all the water spirits, all the ghosts, all the goblins and fairies, all these were perceived by the psyche. So for something to be out of the ordinary wouldn't be out of the ordinary experience, but it would be a new type of experience, in other words. But then later we see the name evolve into the Old Norse Odin and Od. Odin and Od being the same god. Most mythologists would agree on this these days. It is simply a shortening of the name Odin, and thus the stories of Od are also the stories of Odin. Odd is where we get the English word odd from, obviously, and it again means something that is not normal, something that is uncanny. And in Old Norse, we have words associated with Od and Odin, like Odi, or Odd, or Odur, all meaning frenzied or ecstatic, a state of ecstasy, possession, or madness even. And of course, these words bleed into other languages as well, like Old English and Anglo-Saxon. We find the word woed, meaning insane or furious. Or in Old Dutch, we find the word woed, meaning wild or frantic or captivated, mesmerized or even possessed. And then we find in the modern English wooed, which means to be wooed, in other words, which is also synonymous with being swayed, being moved, being changed. And it is associated with strong feelings like love and conviction. And to be wooed is also to be spellbound, so to speak. But then we also find other words in Old Norse that have a very similar meaning and also have a connection to Odin or Wotan. We find words like Othar, meaning mind or song or poetry, or Voth, meaning in Anglo-Saxon, which means sound or noise or songs. Or in Old High German, we find voet, meaning to thrill or to agitate or to excite. Or in Middle Dutch, we find voet, meaning rage or craziness, frenzied, abnormal behavior, and which is arguably the root word for the modern English poet. Yet all these words and all of these names of Odin seem to point consistently to a frenzied state, a point of insanity or madness, but we tend to think of this in negative lights today. If somebody's frenzied, we think of them as incoherent, we think of them as scattered or radical or erratic. And if we think of somebody as insane or mad, we obviously think of them as insane or mad. But in the ancient world, these were not necessarily the way that the ancients would have thought of these things. The frenzied state seemed to pertain more to a creative, ecstatic, enlightened state. It was very much associated with music and poetry, with ambition, with stamina, with bravery and courage. The berserkers, for instance, would become frenzied whenever they were fighting, and in this frenzied state they would also come up with lyrical poetry and rhymes. The musician was also become frenzied, and in drum circles you would see people become frenzied, and at celebrations they would become lost in this frenzied type state. And also it was very much associated with enlightenment and intelligence and spiritual awareness, or emotional intelligence, so to speak. So all these things seem to be what we would more associate with the gurus or the shamans or the enlightened teachers, not so much with crazy lunatics as we would tend to think of them in terms in our modern day. For the shamans, obviously it was beneficial to reach a climatic or ecstatic state, a frenzied state. And most of the time that they would do this, they would use what we now call entheogens. And entheogens are psychedelic substances or psychoactive substances which are used in a spiritual purpose or in a mythological or religious type setting. Yet the use of entheogens was not limited specifically to shamans. Everybody who wanted a spiritual connection would participate in the use of entheogens. Children, women, men, old, young, everybody had access to these entheogens, albeit the shamans were the most notorious for the use of entheogens. Now, briefly looking at the word entheogen, it gives us a little bit of insight into what it actually meant for these pagan practitioners. The word entheogen comes from the Greek, and it means to be filled with God. In other words, to be possessed by the divine, to be filled with holiness, to be filled with the energies and the symbolic attributes of the divine gods and goddesses. And ultimately, this possession, this filling of divinity would lead to a frenzied state. And a frenzied state, to me, from an ancient perspective, seemed to be more akin to a muse or inspiration. It would enlighten one, it would show one new things, it would reveal new secrets, and it would give inspiration and stamina for creativity and introspection. Now, bearing all this in mind, it seems almost synonymous, entheogens and Odin. For everything that the ancients believed about entheogens was also believed about Odin. Not to mention the fact that every aspect of the psychedelic experience seems to have a strong linguistic connection to Odin. In other words, the common denominator, the thing that links everything about Odin together, seems to be the psychedelic phenomenon or the entheogenic experience. Yet now, if I may, I'm going to take us to a little bit more radicalized theory, into the realm of pure speculation and absolute theory with no actual facts to support this theory. Albeit it is an extremely entertaining theory, and albeit it is also a possibility, although not a probability. With this in mind, though, we have to admit that the Germanic practices are extremely connected with the proto-mythological practices, what a lot of people would consider the Indo-European practices. Although I do believe that Indo-European is extremely limiting in its definition, so I tend to use the word proto-mythological because this predates the Indo-European language and practices. With this in mind, we can admit that the Germanic practices have a strong link to the proto-mythological practices, and the proto-mythological practices could be linked as far back as our Neanderthal ancestors. There is no doubt that the Neanderthals most certainly had mythological practices, they had mythological rites and mythological beliefs. They were extremely layered and complex species, far more so than we've ever given them credit for in history. And what I mean by being a sophisticated and complex species is that they had forms of self-awareness and self-representation, self-expression, in other words. And for a species to have self-awareness and self-expression, they have to have an introspective value. They have to look inside themselves. And in our earliest origins, when we looked inside ourselves, we conducted and created mythological beliefs, mythological stories, in order to explain the phenomenon that we experience within ourselves. So there really can be no doubt that with art and with music and with these layered complexities, Neanderthals most certainly had mythological beliefs. They had burial rites, they had funerals, they had all sorts of things which point to mythological practices. Now then, comparing this with the fact that all mythological practices throughout all observable human history have used entheogens. In other words, they've used psychedelics in order to connect them with the divine. The question is, did the Neanderthals utilize entheogens or psychedelic practices to connect them with their gods and goddesses? Now then, if they did, could this be the reason that we see out of nowhere what we consider human consciousness, awareness, self-awareness, and introspection explode onto the scene in the Neanderthal species? Most geneticists and historians and archaeologists are now in agreement that the Neanderthals were not just brutish cavemen as we believed them to once be, but they seem to be the cradle of human consciousness. We have to ask ourselves, what is the causation for this? I have theorized previously that it is the hybridization, that is the interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, which created a stronger, more suitable hybrid species, which is the modern human being. However, this is not necessarily my fundamental belief. I also tend to think in terms of Terence McKenna's idea of the stoned ape theory, that our earlier ancestors ate psychedelic substances. Animals statistically and scientifically are proven to be attracted to psychedelic substances, so it is possible that they were attracted, our ape-like ancestors, to psychedelics, and this created a neuroprocessing to evolve, biologically speaking, to accept the ingestion of psychedelics, in other words. So if Neanderthals were ingesting psychedelics as an entheogenic practice, could this be why we see such a rapid evolution in their overall psychology and neurology? Furthermore, hand in hand with mythology and self-awareness comes the expression of the self in terms of language. And we do know that the Neanderthals also had to have had a sophisticated and extremely intelligible language. Previously, we thought of them to be mutes or speaking in terms of animalistic qualities. But now, looking at the development of their vocal cords, they had very sophisticated phonemes and pronunciation values. This could also be due to what Terence McKenna theorized to be psychedelic correlations. In other words, the Neanderthals developed language to express the experiences they had under the psychedelic substances. So from the simple act of eating a little mushroom, it is possible that Neanderthals developed not only mythological understandings and self-introspection, but they also developed language. And language is also very much linked to Odin, or Wotan. He is the father of the runes, the giver of the runes. He hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights to uncover the secrets of the runes. And the Nordic people and the Germanic people believed the runes to be fundamental elemental forces in nature, that they had always existed, but simply Odin uncovered or discovered these secrets and then gifted them to the gods and to humanity. This could connect Odin, still yet, to the psychedelic substances. Admittedly, towards the tail end of this video, part 2, we become a little bit too enamored with theory and we're not looking so much at fact. And for the people who are really fact-based and wanting to learn, I apologize, but bear with me and have patience, because in part 3 we're going to analyze the nature of Odin and the nature of the psychedelic experience and see how the two genuinely mesh together. So join us for part 3 for a little bit more detailed and fact-based analysis.